Hey there, and welcome to another edition of Nerd Stuff, where I discuss more or less off the dome topics in American history that catch my eye and that I think demand a little more explanation than you usually get on social media. And that includes platforms like this one, YouTube. If you don't know me, my name's Jamel Bowie. I'm a columnist for the New York Times opinion section, and I've been covering American politics and American history for about 15 years now. Now, what are we discussing today? Nothing big, a small topic. We're going to be talking Jim Crow.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow.
First, let's get some sources out of the way. I am indebted to generations of scholars who have studied Jim Crow. One of, I think, the best single volumes you can read even today is The Strange Career of Jim Crow. You can also read The Origins of the New South and The Populist Movement. There are also much more recent books like Equality and American Dilemma, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, and By Hands Now Known. I'll list some others in the comments if you want to do more reading for yourself. Now, why discuss Jim Crow? The previous video in this Nerd Stuff series was on the party switch, the realignment of the Republican and Democratic parties, more or less over the course of the 20th century, driven in large part by the migration of Black Americans from the South to the North following the First World War and the Second World War. That raises an obvious question: why are Black people leaving the South in huge numbers, such that by the late part of the 20th century, more Black Americans live outside of the South than live within the South? So why were they leaving? And the answer is they were leaving Jim Crow. And what was Jim Crow? If you are an American watching this and you had a standard social studies or history class in high school, you may think of Jim Crow as more or less simply being separate institutions, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, various kinds of public disrespect. And those certainly were the symbols of Jim Crow, symbols of outward public disrespect. But that's not what the system was. Jim Crow, the system, was something we would recognize today and describe as today as authoritarian. And specifically, it was an authoritarian system of labor control and political control. The Jim Crow states sharply limited political participation by large parts of their population, most of them Black, but not a small number of them white as well. And the Jim Crow states themselves were largely vehicles for the interest of powerful owners of capital and property, landowners, factory owners, people who had a vested interest in direct control of labor. The social separation, the extreme and atavistic violence, the theft, the plunder, all of these things were downstream of this effort to control political behavior and control labor. They were the mechanisms of that control, the way to keep people in line or keep them bought into the system if they were on the white side of the color line. But in the same way that the point of the plantation system under slavery wasn't to produce white supremacy, it was to produce cotton, white supremacy being a byproduct of this drive to produce a particular commodity. The violence of Jim Crow had a purpose, and the purpose was to control labor and the larger political world. Which means that when we're thinking about the origins of Jim Crow, we have to look for a moment where control over labor and control over politics were still intensely contested, when it was uncertain how things would shake out in the South. And so for that, our story begins in the 1870s, not with the Compromise of 1877, generally thought to be the end of Reconstruction, but with the economic crisis, the Panic of 1873, which really did put a nail in most of the more radical efforts to reconstruct the South, well before the Compromise of 1877. The Panic of 1873, akin to a Great Depression, wiped out the Republican Party in the federal government and gave Democrats, many of whom were still quite sympathetic to the former Confederacy, especially in the South, the foothold in Congress and in the states necessary to begin rolling back as much of the Republican Party program as possible. This meant the campaign of redemption, redeeming the southern states from the supposed indignity of Black rule, of Black political equality. Beginning in 1874, Republican-led Black governments in Louisiana and Mississippi and South Carolina and Virginia start falling to Redeemer coalitions. So that by 1876, that presidential election, Reconstruction is mostly effectively dead throughout most of the South, although it survives a little longer in some places more than others. But here's the thing. Jim Crow does not immediately follow Reconstruction. In fact, a whole lot follows Reconstruction. Part of why I think this video is necessary is that there is a blank spot in our historical memory about the years between Reconstruction and the beginning of the 20th century. It's filled in history textbooks with the Gilded Age, but in the South and really throughout the country, there's a lot happening that helps explain how we get from the end of Reconstruction, where there is not formal segregation by law, where there is still Black political participation in large parts of the South, where there is even still the remnants of biracial political coalitions between Black and white Americans, to the beginning of the 20th century when those things are mostly gone, when the horizons of politics in the South have narrowed considerably. And so back to the Panic of 1873. This was a devastating economic crisis and didn't simply resolve itself. It began a cycle of smaller economic crises, recurring recessions that put tremendous pressure on the economy of the United States, specifically on the agricultural sectors. Farmers were under tremendous debt. They could not make enough money from farming to pay off the debt they went into to plant and harvest in the first place. What you see beginning to happen in the late 1870s and through the 1880s are the bubbling up of political movements dedicated to offering farmers relief from debt, movements dedicated to inflating the value of the currency so that farmers could pay off their debt, and even movements devoted to fundamentally reconfiguring the notion of what a national economy was, who had control over that economy in the interest of protecting the agrarian peoples of the United States and the growing number of industrial laborers. So in the 1880s, we get the Greenback Party. And more critically, we get the Farmers Alliance, a set of cooperatives and political movements dedicated to advancing the interest of farmers. And this is where we get the populist movement. It's a direct response to the economic deprivation of the 1870s and the 1880s. Members of the Farmers Alliance travel throughout the country and specifically through the agricultural regions of the country, through the Midwest and the South, pushing for political mobilization in the interest of farmers, in the interest of debt relief. And this political movement begins to gain real steam. It begins to make a real impact on the politics of these regions. Debtors are beginning to organize for themselves against their creditors. And who were their creditors? In the South, their creditors weren't the owners of the old plantations. They had lost most of their wealth, but their children and grandchildren who had become merchants, who owned some land, who began building factories, and who were in a project of trying to rebuild their wealth. Part of rebuilding the wealth meant seizing control over the labor supply. Slavery was control of the labor supply. And part of what happens during Reconstruction, thanks to the free labor ideology of the Republican Party at the time, is Black Americans in the South, and many white Americans too, trying to seize control of their own labor for their own sake. The merchant landowners of the New South found this intolerable, and as part of Redeemer coalitions did everything in their power to try to put a clamp on freedom of movement for Black Americans. The sharecropping system that emerges in the South during this period is very much part of an effort to restrict the liberty of Black Americans as they are trying to control their own labor. The Farmers Alliances, and soon the Colored Farmers Alliance, one focused specifically on Black farmers, complicates this. The Farmers Alliances are threatening the ability of these merchant landowners to control the labor and control the land for that matter. And these alliances of farmers are creating political wins, are contesting the control of the Redeemers in the states where these alliances of farmers are gaining traction. In Virginia in 1884, the Readjuster movement, a biracial alliance of white and Black farmers aiming for debt relief and greater funding for public education, wins power in Virginia, undermining control by the Redeemer coalitions in the Democratic Party. In North Carolina, a fusion movement of Black Republicans and white populists makes headway in the 1890s, winning statewide elections and winning control of important offices. Populists are contesting Democratic control in Georgia, South Carolina, and other states of the former Confederacy. They aren't always winning, but they are putting up a very strong fight against the merchant landowners called the Bourbon Democrats, who had established a hold on the politics of much of the region. And while it's far too much to say that these agrarian alliances, that these agrarian movements were racially egalitarian in any way, there was a recognition that Black Americans, who made up large parts of the population in many of these states, could provide votes and assistance. They could help the populace contest the control of these southern states by the merchant landowners. Now let's zoom out a little bit and look at the overall social context of the South in this moment. In the late 1870s and 1880s, and even much of the early 1890s, there isn't formal racial segregation, meaning this isn't by law, but it is informal. Blacks stay in one places, whites in another. And beginning in the 1880s and 1890s, there is the campaign of lynchings against Black Americans. Terrible, violent acts of racial terrorism meant to scare communities into submission, often led by leading members of the community. If we zoom out even more to the entire country, we'll see that there is a reaction to, a backlash against, opposition to the populist movement. And there is an even larger effort to restrict political participation. There's an influx of immigrants in the North, an influx of Chinese Americans in the West. Throughout the country, different classes of people, different kinds of people are making a bid for opening up the political system, making a bid for inclusion in that system. And those who are at the top, who already hold power, are very invested in protecting their status. And so up north, we begin to get suffrage restrictions. In the West, we get Chinese exclusion. One thing I think it's important to note is that Chinese exclusion wasn't simply a project of economic and political elites. It was supported very much by the nascent labor movement. And when discussing these events, it's actually very critical to recognize the ways that the white working class understood itself as primarily white and advance its racial interests as well as its class ones. But that's kind of a separate discussion, and I wanted to add that in here as a parenthetical. And in the South, political and economic elites struggling against populism in this prospect of biracial coalitions are looking for ways to tamp down on their political opposition and prevent it from taking shape again, excluding as many people as possible from the mix. This is probably a larger argument to make, or a different argument to make. But you can think of what comes next as being within the lineage of the kind of progressive movements that take shape in the beginning of the 20th century. Efforts at cleaning and cleansing electorates and bringing and making political life more rational and more stable. You see, these Southern elites are also interested in attracting more investment capital to their regions. Populism threatens this, but so too does wild and atavistic mob violence. These elites want to solidify their control on both ends. We get our first glimpse of what this looks like in 1890 in Mississippi, where lawmakers revised their constitution. And this new constitution, the Mississippi Constitution of 1890, is, for all intents and purposes, the first Jim Crow constitution, in that it creates strong suffrage restrictions. It drastically reduces the number of people who can participate in the political process, writing most blacks out, but also a significant portion of whites. And it begins to codify legal segregation, formally separating blacks from whites within the state. It's interesting, concurrent with this in Washington, D.C. is the last effort to pass a federal voting rights bill, called the Force Bill by its opponents, that would have nationalized voter registration in the South to prevent elites from blocking the ability of Black Americans to register to vote. It fails thanks to a Senate filibuster, and the Mississippi Constitution goes through. And that Constitution ends up becoming a model for other elites in other states seeking to do this seeking to run this dual game of clamping down on their white populist political opposition and preventing blacks from becoming a meaningful political force in the states again. And so as the 1890s progresses, you see the introduction of either new constitutions or formal segregation through the South. Infamously in Louisiana, whose laws segregating trains and streetcars comes before the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1897. And it's in Plessy v. Ferguson the Supreme Court gives its blessing to this segregation says that the Constitution has no bearing on arrangements of social equality or inequality, and that as long as things are basically equal between the races, that legal separation is perfectly fine, that the Constitution isn't in the business of saying that there are not racial hierarchies.
The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could have not been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either.
As a parenthetical, this, among other things, is a terrible ruling and awful legal reasoning and directly contradicting the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but that's what Plessy said. And the court would issue other rulings in subsequent years, allowing for things like states and municipalities collecting taxes from their black residents, but not spending those tax dollars on infrastructure, schools, roads, hospitals for those black residents, essentially allowing a kind of state-sanctioned plunder. By the first years of the 20th century, most southern states had adopted new constitutions that institutionalized racial separation, segregation, and the unequal distribution of resources. In my own state of Virginia, its 1902 Constitution does this, with one of its architects, a man named Carter Glass, stating that the purpose of this Constitution is to remove the, quote, Negro from political life forever. That's a rough paraphrase. I'll put the actual quote up here. The thing about shutting black Americans and most white Americans out of political life meant that you also were able to restrict them in their economic lives as well. They could not protest economic disenfranchisement and exploitation through politics. And so what you see as well, in addition to plummeting voter registration rates, plummeting rates of political participation, a closed-off political life in these states, is the rise of intensely exploitative enterprises. In Alabama, that's steel. In North Carolina, that's textiles. In much of the South, it's still agriculture. Whatever it is, it's vicious economic exploitation by these merchant landowner elites and their political allies. And with this vicious economic exploitation comes profound disinvestment in the region. Capital might flow to particular projects for particular people, but there isn't investment happening in the communities. The South is left incredibly poor, a closed off and even somewhat isolated region of the United States. And although there are occasional politicians here and there throughout the rest of the country who might take an interest in doing something about this, by closing black Americans out of politics, Southern elites did something quite ingenious. Because although black Americans could not vote and could not participate, they still counted for representation. In an echo of the Three-Fifths Compromise, Jim Crow elites got even more political power thanks to being able to count black Americans for representation purposes, but never having to respond to them in politics. And because of the internal arrangements of the Democratic Party, in which presidential nominations require two-thirds support at the conventions, Southerners also had essentially a lock on the Democratic Party, being as they were the largest single bloc that could determine who got a nomination, who held the center of gravity within the party. And because of their lock on political power in their own states, they were also the most likely to be able to have control of committee assignments in the House and the Senate, giving them even more authority. They could steer federal funds through their states and districts, deny them to large parts of the population, and then block any attempts at federal intervention. Hence the incredible difficulty and basically impossibility of passing a federal lynching law, or the ways in which Southern lawmakers shaped how the New Deal was implemented in the South by doing as much as they could to exclude agricultural and domestic workers, many of whom in the region were Black American. This was Jim Crow. This is what it was. An authoritarian system of labor control. A system of white supremacy where all whites were not supreme. Most whites, in fact, were not well off under this system. But the social separation, the distribution of some resources to these communities, created the illusion of superiority, inculcated the sense that they had something to gain from the continuation of this social order. And then there was the violence. Lynchings were just the most dramatic example of the kind of violence that was visited on Black Americans throughout the Jim Crow period. Beatings, harassment, sexual assault. These things were part of life under Jim Crow. So to recap, Jim Crow, a system of labor control that emerges in response to agrarian and populist uprisings of the 1880s and 1890s that seeks to put a definitive clamp down on the political activity of blacks and many whites for the sake of controlling their labor, controlling their ability to choose where and how they work. And supported, on the one hand, by the carrot of, as Du Bois put it, a psychological wage, and by the stick of horrendous violence against those, specifically Black Americans, who might resist. And so, why was there this great migration as soon as industrial production began to explode during the First World War? It was because this arrangement sucked. This was a terrible way to live. And the one thing that Jim Crow states could not do is control their borders. They were still part of the United States. And if you could get out, you could get out. You could escape. And that was really the question. Were you going to try to escape or live as isolated as you could? The movie Sinners speaks to both options. The Smokestack twins escaped to Chicago because of the First World War. They join up, and they return to Mississippi in a somewhat isolated location in an attempt to find a life there. And that is very truthful to the actual situation of Black Americans in the South. Now, the irony of all of this is that Jim Crow would fall because it was pushing Black Americans out. And this is where our party switch conversation comes in. That the migration of Black Americans to the North turned them once again into a political force that could influence the politics of one of the two major parties, this time the Democratic Party. The same Democratic Party whose southern wing was the instrument of this system of oppression, its northern wing was somewhat separated by it. And once its northern wing begins representing large numbers of Black Americans, there emerges within the Northern Democratic Party politicians who see both electoral interest in trying to do something about Jim Crow, but also feel a moral obligation, because through all of this, Black Americans are still organizing politically to try to make their case to the nation, to say that this is unacceptable, that this must end, that this kind of unfreedom makes a mockery of American ideals. It's not an accident that the modern civil rights movement gets started in the wake of the Second World War, because it's the Second World War that does a couple of things. It brings many Black Americans out of the South into the North or to abroad, gives them wartime service. It puts in stark relief the importance of pushing against virulent forms of racism that brought the world to the brink of catastrophe. It gave many Black Americans new training and skills in leadership that they would bring home to their communities. And it began to show white Americans as well the importance of standing up against this kind of racism and oppression. Every system contains contradictions. Every system contains the seeds of its own demise. In Jim Crow, in the virulence of its racism, in the atavism of its violence, in the harsh restrictions it imposed on people, produced the dynamics and the personalities that would lead to its destruction. But the new thing always contains elements of the old. The Jim Crow system, a synthesis of antebellum slavocracy and Reconstruction possibility, gave way to a new kind of political order, one that repudiated the explicit racism of Jim Crow and the violence, but still contained some of the seeds of economic exploitation and domination and control of labor. And I would argue that it's that legacy of Jim Crow, of political and economic elites seeking to clamp down on democracy for the sake of their own pockets, for the sake of capital, that imperils us today.